You really shouldn't have access to that much money, Evelyn, my mother-in-law said as she calmly buttered a dinner roll across the table. The room went silent. For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood her. Ryan stopped chewing and stared at his plate. The soft music playing from the kitchen suddenly felt too loud. I looked around my dining room, the same room I had spent years decorating, hosting holidays in, and filling with memories. Yet somehow, in that moment, I felt like a stranger sitting in my own home. I'm Evelyn Parker, and at 66 years old, I thought I understood the difference between concern and control. That night, I learned how wrong I was. Barbara Mitchell had been my mother-in-law for nearly 35 years. People described her as organized, practical, and deeply involved in family matters. For years, I had tried to see those qualities as strengths. Whenever she offered advice, I smiled. Whenever she criticized a decision, I told myself she meant well. Whenever she inserted herself into situations that didn't involve her, I convinced myself it came from a place of love. Looking back now, I realize I spent decades explaining away behavior that should have concerned me from the beginning. Dinner had started normally enough. Ryan and I had invited Barbara over for her favorite meal: baked chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans seasoned the way she liked. The conversation drifted from neighborhood news to rising grocery prices. Then Barbara casually asked how my rental property was doing. I owned a small 3-bedroom house about 15 miles away that provided additional retirement income. The property had been one of the smartest financial decisions I'd ever made. "Everything's going well," I replied. "The tenants renewed their lease for another year." Barbara nodded slowly. "And how much are they paying now?" I told her. Her eyebrows lifted. "That's quite a bit of money every month." I shrugged. "It helps cover expenses." She set down her fork. "Well, that's exactly why I'm concerned." Concerned. The word sounded harmless. It rarely is. Concerned about what? I asked. Barbara folded her hands neatly on the table. "You're retired. You're getting older. Managing property, handling rent payments, making financial decisions. It can become overwhelming. Someone should probably oversee those things for you." I laughed lightly, assuming she was joking. She wasn't. "I'm perfectly capable of managing my finances," I said. Barbara's expression didn't change. "That's what worries me. People your age often don't realize when they need help." My age. Not our age. Barbara was only 6 years older than I was. Before I could respond, she leaned back in her chair and delivered the sentence that changed everything. "You really shouldn't have access to that much money, Evelyn." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Ryan shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. I waited for him to laugh, to defend me, to point out how ridiculous the statement was. Instead, he reached for his water glass and avoided eye contact. That hurt more than Barbara's comment. I looked directly at her. "Excuse me." Barbara smiled as though she were explaining something obvious to a child. "I'm only trying to help. Family should protect family from making mistakes." I nodded slowly. Then I smiled. Not because I agreed. Not because I was comfortable. I smiled because, for the first time, I saw something clearly. This wasn't about helping me. It wasn't about age. It wasn't even about money. It was about control. And although Barbara didn't know it yet, that dinner was the beginning of the biggest mistake she would ever make. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise, something I had done almost every day since retiring. The house was quiet. Ryan was still asleep upstairs. I made a cup of coffee and sat by the kitchen window, looking out at the maple tree in the backyard. Normally, that view brought me peace. That morning, it only brought questions. I kept hearing Barbara's voice repeating in my mind. Not loud, not angry, calm, certain. That was what unsettled me most. She had spoken as though she already had authority over decisions that belonged to me. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting. Families sometimes crossed boundaries without realizing it. Perhaps she had simply chosen her words poorly. Perhaps I was being sensitive. But as I sat there watching the first light touch the grass, old memories began surfacing one after another. Small moments. Moments I had dismissed for years. A few hours later, my phone rang. It was Barbara. I stared at the screen for several seconds before answering. "Good morning, Evelyn," she said cheerfully. I have been thinking about our conversation. I had not considered it a conversation, mostly because I had done very little talking. "Have you?" I asked. "I have," she replied. "And I think we should sit down sometime this week and go over your finances together." I nearly laughed. Not because it was funny, because of how casually she said it. as though the decision had already been made. "There is nothing to go over," I said politely. "Everything is under control." There was a brief pause. "You say that now," she answered. "But these things become harder as people get older." Again, age. The same explanation. The same excuse. I ended the call as politely as possible, but the uneasy feeling remained. Over the next few days, I started noticing things I had ignored before. Barbara always wanted details. How much I spent on repairs. How much rent I collected. How much property tax I paid. At family gatherings, she often redirected conversations toward finances. I had always assumed it was curiosity. Now I was not so sure. By Thursday afternoon, another incident pushed my concerns further. I was reviewing paperwork related to my rental property when one of my tenants, a young teacher named Lauren, called unexpectedly. Her voice sounded hesitant. "I hope I am not bothering you," she said, "but I wanted to check something." "Of course," I replied. "What is going on?" Lauren paused. "A woman called me yesterday. She said she was helping manage the property." I sat up straighter. "What woman?" "Barbara Mitchell," Lauren said. "She said she was family and wanted to discuss future maintenance plans." For a moment, I could not speak. My fingers tightened around the phone. Barbara had never mentioned contacting my tenants. Not once. Lauren continued carefully. "She seemed very confident, so I assumed you knew about it." I looked across the room at the framed documents hanging on my wall, the deed, the insurance records, the years of work that had allowed me to buy that property. Everything was legally mine. Yet somehow Barbara had already begun presenting herself as part of its management. I thanked Lauren for calling and assured her that all future communication should come directly from me. After we hung up, I remained seated at the kitchen table for a long time. The puzzle pieces were starting to fit together, and the picture they formed was far more troubling than I had imagined. That evening, I did something I had not done in years. I opened an old storage box in the hall closet and started going through documents. Most of them were ordinary records from different stages of life. Tax returns, property insurance policies, mortgage paperwork from decades earlier. But I was not searching for numbers. I was searching for memories. The longer I sat there, the more examples surfaced. Barbara had always found ways to place herself in situations that did not belong to her. When Ryan and I bought our first home, she insisted on attending meetings with contractors. When we refinanced years later, she somehow knew details I never remembered sharing. Even after I purchased the rental property, she regularly asked questions that felt unusually specific. At the time, I told myself she was simply interested. Now I was beginning to understand that interest and involvement were not always the same thing. The next morning, I decided to speak with Ryan. He was sitting on the back patio drinking coffee before work. The air was cool, and the neighborhood was still quiet. I sat across from him and asked a simple question. "Did you know your mother contacted my tenant?" Ryan looked surprised. "She did what?" For a moment, I felt relieved. His reaction seemed genuine. I explained everything Lauren had told me. Ryan listened without interrupting. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and rubbed his forehead. "That sounds like Mom," he said quietly. I stared at him. "That sounds like Mom." He sighed. "You know how she is. She always thinks she is helping." There it was again. The same excuse. The same shield that had protected Barbara from consequences for years. I did not argue. Instead, I asked another question. "Would you contact someone else's tenant and discuss their property without permission?" Ryan hesitated. "No." "Then why is it acceptable when your mother does it?" He did not have an answer. The conversation ended shortly afterward, but it left me with an uncomfortable realization. Ryan was not encouraging Barbara's behavior, yet he was not stopping it either. Sometimes silence creates space for problems to grow. Later that afternoon, another surprise arrived. My phone buzzed with a text message from a neighbor who lived near the rental house. Attached was a photograph. I opened it and felt my stomach tighten. The image showed Barbara standing in the driveway of my property, talking to two people I did not recognize. The timestamp showed it had been taken the previous day. I enlarged the photo. Barbara was smiling and gesturing toward the house as though she were giving a tour. My neighbor added a short message beneath the picture. "Thought you should know. She has been here twice this week." I sat frozen at my desk. Twice this week. Not once. Twice. Without mentioning it to me. Without asking permission. Without any reason to be there. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. One incident could be explained away. Two might be coincidence. But this was different. Each new piece fit perfectly beside the last one. The comments about my age, the questions about my finances, the call to my tenant, the visits to the property. None of it felt random anymore. For the first time, I stopped asking whether Barbara was crossing boundaries. The real question was how far she intended to go. That night, I could not stop thinking about the photograph. I placed my phone on the kitchen counter and walked through the house, turning off lights one by one. Normally, those small routines helped settle my mind. Not this time. Every room seemed to hold another memory of a moment I had overlooked. Barbara had never been loud about what she wanted. She did not demand control. She simply stepped into spaces that did not belong to her and acted as though she had every right to be there. Years ago, when Ryan and I took our first long vacation after retirement, Barbara volunteered to check on our home. When we returned, she handed me a detailed list of things she thought I should change. Rearrange the guest room, replace the curtains, move money from one account to another because she had read an article about investing. At the time, I laughed it off. Now those memories felt different. They no longer seemed helpful. They felt like early warnings. The following morning, I drove to the rental property. It was about a 20-minute trip across town. The neighborhood was quiet and well-maintained. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalks. Lawns were neatly trimmed. It was exactly the kind of area I had hoped to invest in years earlier. When I arrived, Lauren was outside watering flowers near the front porch. She smiled when she saw me. We exchanged greetings before I carefully asked about Barbara's visit. Lauren looked uncomfortable. I did not want to create problems, she said, but she seemed very involved. Involved how? I asked. Lauren hesitated. She asked questions about future lease terms. She mentioned possible changes. She even asked whether I planned to stay long-term. My heart sank. Those were conversations only an owner or property manager should have. Barbara was neither. Lauren continued. Honestly, I thought she worked with you. I thanked her for being honest. Before leaving, I walked slowly around the property. The fence looked good. The landscaping was healthy. Everything appeared exactly as it should. Yet I felt uneasy standing there. Not because of the house itself, because someone else had started acting as though they had authority over it. On the drive home, another memory surfaced. About 6 months earlier, Barbara had asked whether I had considered putting her name on certain emergency documents just in case. At the time, I declined politely. She smiled and changed the subject. I remembered feeling relieved the conversation had ended so easily. Now I wondered whether she had simply moved on to a different approach. That evening, I reviewed my records more carefully than ever before. I checked property files, banking information, contact lists, and account permissions. Nothing appeared compromised. Everything remained legally secure. That should have reassured me. Instead, it raised another question. If Barbara had no formal authority, why was she acting as though she did? As midnight approached, I closed the final folder and sat quietly at the dining room table. The same table where she had questioned my ability to manage my own finances. For the first time, I stopped viewing the situation as a misunderstanding. Too many incidents pointed in the same direction. Too many boundaries had been crossed. Barbara was not preparing for an emergency. She was positioning herself for influence. And the more I looked back, the more convinced I became that she had been planning it for much longer than I realized. The next week, I decided it was time to stop collecting clues and start establishing boundaries. I called Barbara and invited her to lunch at a small cafe near the town square. It was a quiet place with large windows and fresh flowers on every table. Neutral territory. Public. Calm. I arrived early and spent several minutes thinking carefully about what I wanted to say. When Barbara walked in, she greeted me with her usual confidence, as though nothing unusual had happened. We ordered lunch and exchanged a few polite comments before I finally addressed the issue. Barbara, I need to talk to you about the rental property. Her smile barely changed. What about it? I kept my voice steady. I learned that you contacted my tenant. I also know you have visited the property several times. She folded her napkin neatly beside her plate. I was only helping. The answer came so quickly that it sounded rehearsed. I did not ask for help, I replied. And I need you to understand that all communication regarding the property needs to come directly from me. For the first time, a trace of irritation crossed her face. Evelyn, you are taking this far too personally. I shook my head. No, I am taking it seriously. Barbara leaned forward. Someone has to think about the future. You cannot manage everything forever. There it was again. The assumption, the certainty, the belief that my decisions required her supervision. I did not argue. Instead, I calmly explained that I was fully capable of managing my finances, my investments, and my property. I told her that any future contact with tenants, contractors, or service providers would be inappropriate unless I specifically requested it. The conversation should have ended there. Instead, Barbara sighed dramatically and looked away toward the window. "After everything I have done for this family," she said softly, "I never expected to be treated like an outsider." I recognized the shift immediately. The discussion was no longer about boundaries. It had become about guilt. When I refused to react emotionally, she continued, "I only care because I worry about you." I nodded. "I appreciate concern. I do not appreciate interference." Lunch ended shortly afterward. We left politely, but the tension remained. That evening, Ryan asked how the meeting had gone. I explained everything. He listened quietly before saying something that surprised me. "Mom called me afterward." I looked up from the kitchen counter. "What did she say?" Ryan hesitated. "She thinks you are shutting her out." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was predictable. Boundaries often feel like rejection to people who have grown comfortable ignoring them. Over the next several days, the atmosphere within the family changed. Barbara became distant. Messages that once received immediate replies now went unanswered for hours. Family group conversations felt strained. Yet despite the discomfort, I noticed something important. For the first time in years, I felt clear. I was no longer second-guessing myself. I was no longer explaining away behavior that made me uncomfortable. Then, just as things seemed to be settling down, a phone call arrived that changed everything. It came from a local real estate agent, and what she told me made it impossible to believe Barbara's actions were innocent. The next morning, I returned the call from the real estate agent. Her name was Melissa, and I had worked with her briefly years earlier when I purchased the rental property. She sounded professional, but slightly confused. "Evelyn, I wanted to verify something," she said. "A woman contacted me asking questions about the property. She seemed to believe there might be future ownership changes." I felt my grip tighten around the phone. Did she identify herself? "Yes," Melissa replied. "Barbara Mitchell." For several seconds, I said nothing. Melissa continued carefully. "I did not provide any confidential information, of course, but she seemed very interested in understanding the property's value, long-term equity, and possible transfer options." After we ended the call, I sat quietly in my home office staring at the wall. The pieces that had seemed disconnected only a few weeks earlier were now forming a clear picture. Barbara was not simply curious about my finances. She was studying them. She was gathering information. More importantly, she was focusing almost entirely on the rental property. That afternoon, I began reviewing old conversations and messages. Most were ordinary family exchanges. Then I noticed something I had previously ignored. Over the past year, Barbara had brought up the rental house repeatedly. Sometimes she mentioned how peaceful the neighborhood seemed. Other times, she commented on how convenient the location was. Once she even joked that she would enjoy living there herself. At the time, everyone laughed. Now the memory felt different. I opened my email archive and searched her name. Dozens of messages appeared. The more I read, the more a pattern emerged. Questions about maintenance costs. Questions about insurance. Questions about lease agreements. Questions about property taxes. Barbara knew far more about that house than any family member reasonably should. A few days later, I attended a family birthday gathering at my sister-in-law's home. I had no intention of discussing the situation. I simply wanted a quiet afternoon. Unfortunately, the subject found me. While standing near the dessert table, I overheard two relatives talking. One of them smiled when she saw me. "Evelyn, Barbara says you have some big plans for the rental property." I froze. "What kind of plans?" The woman looked surprised. She mentioned that eventually the house would probably stay in the family. Another relative nodded. "Yes." She said it would make sense for her to live there someday. My heart sank. Barbara had been discussing the property with other people as though future decisions had already been made. Decisions that belonged entirely to me. I remained polite and changed the subject, but internally something shifted. Until then, part of me had still hoped there was a misunderstanding. That hope disappeared. Later that evening, I shared everything with Ryan. The conversation was difficult. He listened quietly as I described the call from Melissa and the comments I heard at the gathering. For the first time, I saw genuine concern in his face. "You think she wants the house?" he asked. I looked directly at him. "I think this stopped being about advice a long time ago." Ryan stared out the window for several moments. Neither of us spoke. Finally, he sighed. I never realized how much attention she was paying to it. Neither had I. But now I understood something important. The rental property was not just an investment in Barbara's eyes. It represented influence, security, and control. And if I was right, she was not finished trying to claim a role in its future. 3 days later, the situation escalated in a way I could never have predicted. I was organizing paperwork in my home office when Lauren called again. This time her voice sounded nervous. "Evelyn, I think you need to know what happened this morning." I immediately stopped what I was doing. "What is it?" There was a brief pause before she answered. "Barbara was here again." I closed my eyes. "What did she do?" Lauren took a breath. "She brought 2 people with her. They walked around the property and spent almost 20 minutes outside looking at the yard and the exterior of the house." My stomach tightened. "Did she explain why?" "Not exactly," Lauren said, "but I overheard part of the conversation." I waited. She told them that she expected to be living there in the future. The room suddenly felt very quiet. For months, maybe longer, Barbara had been creating a version of reality that existed only in her mind. The difference now was that she was sharing that version with other people. After ending the call, I sat motionless for several minutes. I was no longer dealing with assumptions or indirect comments. I was dealing with actions, real actions, actions that involved other people and a property that belonged solely to me. Later that afternoon, I received another unexpected call. This time it came from one of the neighbors near the rental house. He introduced himself and politely explained that he had witnessed Barbara speaking with several individuals over the past few weeks. "I thought she owned the place," he admitted. "She talks about it like she does." That sentence stayed with me long after the call ended. "She talks about it like she does." I realized that Barbara was not simply crossing boundaries anymore. She was creating expectations. Expectations among neighbors. Expectations among relatives. Expectations among people who had no reason to question what she was saying. That evening, I reviewed everything I had learned over the previous month. The comments at family gatherings. The conversations with my tenant. The inquiries to the real estate agent. The repeated visits to the property. Individually, each event might have seemed minor. Together, they revealed a clear pattern. I decided it was time to stop wondering and start verifying. The next day, I drove to the rental property myself. Lauren greeted me at the door and showed me something I had not seen before. Security cameras from a neighboring home had captured part of Barbara's visit. The footage showed her standing in the driveway, speaking confidently to 2 strangers. Although there was no audio, her body language told its own story. She pointed toward the house. She gestured toward the yard. She spoke with complete confidence, as though she belonged there, as though future ownership had already been decided. I watched the footage twice, then a third time. By the end, any remaining doubt had disappeared. Barbara was not preparing for a possibility. She was acting as though it was inevitable. On the drive home, I called Ryan and asked him to meet me that evening. When he arrived, I showed him everything. The photographs, the messages, the timeline I had assembled, the camera footage. He watched in silence. When the video ended, he leaned back in his chair and stared at the screen. For the first time since this began, he looked genuinely shocked. Then he quietly asked a question that confirmed I was not imagining any of it. How long has she been planning this? Ryan's question lingered in the room long after he asked it. Neither of us had an answer. The only thing we knew for certain was that the situation could not continue. The following morning, I began taking practical steps. Not dramatic steps, not emotional ones, practical ones. I contacted the property management software company and updated every account credential connected to the rental property. I reviewed emergency contacts, tenant communication settings, and document access permissions. Everything remained secure, but I wanted complete certainty. Next, I spoke with my attorney. The conversation lasted less than an hour. After reviewing the circumstances, he gave simple advice. Maintain clear records. Communicate boundaries in writing. Protect access to your property and financial information. It was not complicated. It was common sense. Yet hearing it from a professional gave me confidence. Later that week, I drafted a polite but direct email to Barbara. I spent nearly an hour choosing the right words. I was not interested in winning an argument. I was interested in eliminating confusion. The message explained that all matters related to the rental property, tenants, finances, and future planning would remain solely under my control. I also stated that any communication with tenants or third parties regarding the property was unauthorized and needed to stop immediately. Before sending it, I showed the email to Ryan. He read it carefully and nodded. "This is fair," he said. "There is nothing unreasonable here." I agreed. The email contained no accusations, no insults, no threats, just boundaries. Barbara's response arrived later that evening. It was much longer than my original message. According to her, she had been misunderstood. According to her, she was only thinking about the family's future. According to her, everyone else was overreacting. What stood out most was what she did not do. She never apologized. She never acknowledged contacting my tenant. She never addressed the conversations with the real estate agent. She never explained the visits to the property. Instead, she focused entirely on her intentions. But intentions do not erase actions. Over the next several days, family members began reaching out. Some had heard pieces of the story. Others had apparently spoken with Barbara directly. What surprised me was how many people expressed support. Several relatives admitted they had noticed similar behavior for years. One cousin quietly told me, "Barbara has always assumed she should be involved in decisions that are not hers." Another relative confessed that she often felt pressured into following Barbara's advice even when she disagreed with it. For the first time, I realized I was not the only person who had experienced this pattern. The difference was that this time there was documentation. There were phone calls, messages, witnesses, a timeline. Facts are difficult to dismiss. Then, just when I believed the situation was finally settling down, Lauren contacted me once more. Her voice sounded concerned. "Evelyn, I thought you should know something," she said. "Someone stopped by the property again this afternoon." My stomach tightened. "Who?" There was a brief pause. "Barbara." I closed my eyes. After everything that had happened, after the conversations, the emails, the evidence, she had returned anyway. And according to Lauren, this visit would become the incident that changed everything. When Lauren told me Barbara had returned to the property, I expected more of the same behavior. Another visit, another conversation, another attempt to insert herself where she did not belong. What I did not expect was what happened next. According to Lauren, Barbara had arrived with complete confidence. She spent nearly 30 minutes speaking with someone in the driveway. Then she pointed toward the house several times while discussing possible future renovations. Lauren did not approach them. Instead, she simply observed from a distance and later documented everything she could remember. By that point, I had reached my limit. Not emotionally. Practically, every reasonable boundary had already been communicated. Every misunderstanding had been clarified. Every opportunity to step back had been offered. That evening, I contacted my attorney once again and reviewed the entire situation from beginning to end. His advice was straightforward. Continue protecting the property. Continue documenting interactions. And most importantly, stop assuming the behavior would correct itself. Sometimes the most effective response is not confrontation. It is enforcement. Over the following week, I finalized several decisions. Access permissions were tightened. Communication channels were streamlined. Every tenant received written instructions confirming that all property matters were to be handled directly through me. No exceptions. No intermediaries. No confusion. At the same time, Ryan finally had a difficult conversation with Barbara. I was not present for it, but afterward he told me something I will never forget. She genuinely believed she was entitled to be involved, he said quietly. That sentence explained more than any argument ever could. Barbara had convinced herself that proximity created ownership. That family connection created authority. That concern justified control. It did not. A few days later, she requested a meeting. We sat across from one another in a quiet restaurant much like we had before. The difference was that this time there was nothing left to debate. I listened respectfully as she explained her perspective. She spoke about family, security, future planning, good intentions. When she finished, I thanked her for sharing her thoughts. Then I calmly explained mine. I told her that ownership carried responsibility. Responsibility required accountability. And accountability belonged to the person who had built, maintained, and managed the asset. I told her that my financial decisions would remain my own. My property decisions would remain my own. My future would remain my own. She did not like hearing it, but she heard it. For the first time since this situation began, there was no argument. No attempt to persuade me otherwise. Just silence. The months that followed were surprisingly peaceful. The property continued performing well. Lauren renewed her lease. Maintenance projects stayed on schedule. Life moved forward. More importantly, something changed within my family. Ryan began recognizing patterns he had overlooked for years. Several relatives quietly admitted they respected the boundaries I had established. Even Barbara eventually stopped discussing the property as though it belonged in her plans. Looking back, I learned something valuable from the entire experience. Control rarely announces itself openly. It often arrives disguised as help. It speaks the language of concern. It presents itself as guidance. But genuine support respects boundaries. Genuine support does not assume ownership over another person's life. Today, when I sit at my kitchen table and look out at the maple tree in the backyard, I feel something I had not felt in a long time. Clarity. Not because I won a battle, not because someone lost, but because I finally protected what mattered. Family should be built on respect, not control. And the moment I stopped apologizing for my boundaries was the moment I found my peace again.